The billionaire had spent 30 years searching for the woman who saved him when he had nothing. Not because he wanted to repay a debt, but because he needed to find the one person who believed he mattered when the entire world had forgotten him. He hired private investigators. He followed every clue. He offered millions for answers. But every trail went cold until one ordinary Tuesday night. Inside a small, forgotten diner from his childhood, he saw an elderly woman sitting alone at the corner table. She wasn't waiting for anyone. She wasn't expecting a miracle. She was quietly emptying a handful of coins from an old purse, counting them twice, trying to decide if she could afford a simple meal. The richest man in the city stood there watching the woman who looked invisible to everyone else, and something inside him told him not to walk away. So he approached her table, pulled out a chair, and asked, "Can I buy you dinner?" The woman slowly looked up. For a moment she said nothing. She studied his face like she was looking through decades of memories. Then her eyes filled with tears. Because the billionaire standing in front of her was not the powerful man the world knew today. He was the frightened 14-year-old boy she once found alone, hungry and ready to give up. And then she whispered the words that made his entire world stop. "You don't remember me, do you?" What happened next would reveal a secret that had been hidden for 30 years and change both of their lives forever. Before we go further into this story, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if you're new here, click the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. His name was David Cole, and by the time he was 52 years old, he had built one of the largest technology companies in the country. Magazines called him ruthless. Competitors called him unstoppable. Employees called him fair but distant, a man who never let anyone get too close. What none of them knew was that David carried a weight he had never spoken about publicly. Somewhere underneath the success, the private jets, and the boardroom victories, there was a teenage boy who once slept on a bus station bench with nothing but a torn backpack and a stomach that ached from hunger. That boy never fully disappeared. He simply learned to hide behind expensive suits and confident handshakes. The woman sitting across from him that evening was named Margaret Ellison, though everyone who had ever known her simply called her Miss Ellison. She was 68 years old, a retired English teacher who lived alone in a small apartment above a laundromat. Her monthly pension barely covered her bills, and she had grown used to skipping small comforts so she could keep her heat running through the winter. To anyone who passed her on the street, she looked like just another quiet, elderly woman, easy to overlook, easy to forget. But Margaret carried a secret that very few people in the world knew, a secret that connected her directly to the powerful man now sitting across from her, offering to pay for a plate of food she could barely afford. David insisted on paying, assuming she was simply too proud to accept help from a stranger. He had seen that kind of pride before, and he respected it, even as he gently pushed past it. What he did not understand yet was that Margaret's hesitation had nothing to do with pride. It had everything to do with recognition. She had known exactly who he was the moment he walked through the door, though decades had passed and life had reshaped his face in ways only a mother, or someone who loved a child deeply, could still see through. He had no idea that the woman sitting across from him was the reason he had a future at all. To understand why this moment mattered so much, we have to go back more than 30 years to a much colder, much harder version of David's life. Back then, he was not a businessman. He was a boy named Daniel, though he later changed his name when he left that part of his life behind. His parents had died when he was young, and the relatives who took him in made it clear, in ways both spoken and unspoken, that he was a burden rather than a member of the family. By the time he was 14, he had learned to expect very little from the people around him. He carried his school books in a plastic grocery bag because he did not own a backpack that still had both straps intact. Teachers at his school mostly saw him as a problem to be managed, rather than a child to be understood. He was quiet in class, not because he had nothing to say, but because he had learned that speaking up rarely changed anything. He often skipped lunch, not because he was not hungry, but because he did not want classmates to see that he had no lunch to eat. He would sit outside during that period, pretending to read, while his stomach twisted with hunger he had grown almost used to ignoring. Nobody asked him directly if he was okay. Nobody, except for one teacher, who noticed the small things everyone else had trained themselves not to see. Margaret Ellison taught English literature at his school, and unlike most of the staff, she paid attention to the quiet students just as much as the loud ones. She noticed that Daniel's uniform shirts were always slightly too small, as if they had been worn for years past when they should have been replaced. She noticed that his shoes were held together with tape near the toe. She noticed that he never once brought a permission slip home signed, because there was no one at home who cared enough to sign it. Most importantly, she noticed the way his eyes lit up whenever the class discussed a novel, even though he rarely said a word out loud about it. One afternoon, after most of the students had left the classroom, Margaret asked Daniel to stay behind for a moment. He assumed he was in trouble, and he braced himself the way he always did, expecting to be lectured about his grades or his attitude. Instead, she simply asked him if he had eaten lunch that day. He lied and said yes. She looked at him for a long moment, the kind of look that told him she already knew the truth, but she did not push him further. She simply placed a sandwich wrapped in wax paper on his desk and told him it was extra from her own lunch, even though it was not. That small act became a quiet pattern over the following months. Margaret would find small ways to make sure Daniel had something to eat, without ever making him feel like charity was being handed to him. She would leave an extra sandwich, claim she had accidentally packed too much fruit, or mention that she had bought too many granola bars at the store and needed someone to help her finish them. Daniel was not foolish. He understood what she was doing. But he also understood that she was giving him something far more valuable than food. She was giving him dignity, the sense that someone in the world had noticed him and decided he was worth the effort. As the school year continued, Margaret began to see something in Daniel that she suspected he had never been told before. He was intelligent, sharper than most students, twice his age, with a memory for detail and a way of understanding characters in books that surprised her every time he finally spoke up in class. She began encouraging him to apply for a scholarship program at a private school across town, one known for pulling talented students out of difficult situations and giving them a real chance at a future. Daniel laughed the first time she suggested it. He told her people like him did not get chances like that. She told him that was exactly the kind of thinking she intended to change. What Daniel did not know, and would not learn until decades later, was that the scholarship he eventually received was not fully covered by the program itself. There was a gap, a portion of tuition and school supplies that the scholarship did not include, and Margaret quietly paid that gap herself, using savings she had been setting aside for her own retirement. She never told anyone what she had done. She simply told the school administration that an anonymous donor wished to cover the remaining balance, and she made sure her own name was never attached to the gift. She believed, deeply and firmly, that Daniel deserved to feel like he had earned this chance, not like he owed someone a debt he could never repay. Years passed, and Daniel grew into a young man who worked harder than anyone around him, driven by a hunger that went far beyond food. He earned a degree in business, then a second degree in computer science, working nights and weekends to support himself the entire time. He started a small technology company in a rented office with 2 folding tables and a second-hand computer, and through sheer stubbornness and a refusal to give up, that company eventually grew into something enormous. Along the way, he changed his name from Daniel to David, partly to separate himself from a childhood full of pain, and partly because he wanted to build an identity that felt entirely his own. Somewhere in the middle of building his empire, Daniel, now David, went looking for the teacher who had changed his life. He returned to his old school, only to learn that Margaret Ellison had retired years earlier and moved away, leaving no forwarding address that the school still had on file. He hired people to search for her, quietly, without publicity, because he did not want this to become a story for the media. He wanted to find her simply to say thank you, to tell her that the sandwich she once left on his desk had eventually helped build a company that employed thousands of people. But every lead went cold, every search ended in disappointment, and eventually, life's demands pulled his attention elsewhere. Now, sitting across from her in that small diner so many years later, David still had no idea he had finally found her. He simply saw an elderly woman who reminded him, in some vague and unexplainable way, of comfort he could not quite place. When she asked him if he remembered her, he felt something shift inside his chest, a mixture of confusion and a strange, unfamiliar warmth. He studied her face carefully, searching for a memory that felt just out of reach, the way a word sits on the tip of your tongue without fully forming. He asked her, gently, how they might know each other. Margaret smiled softly and told him that was a conversation for another day. If this story has touched your heart so far, comment the words, "Kindness Matters" below. I want to know how many of you are still with us, still watching, still feeling this story the way it deserves to be felt. Over the following weeks, David found himself returning to that same diner, hoping to see Margaret again, though he told himself it was simply curiosity. Each time, they talked a little longer. She never confirmed exactly who she was, but she asked careful questions about his childhood, questions that felt oddly specific for a stranger to ask. She asked if he remembered a teacher who once gave him extra lunch. She asked if he remembered applying for a scholarship he did not think he deserved. David's chest tightened every time she asked these things, because slowly, piece by piece, the fog around an old memory was beginning to clear, though he still could not fully believe what his mind was suggesting to him. During this same period, David's closest business advisor, a sharp and image-focused man named Richard Blake, began to notice how much time his boss was spending with an elderly woman who had no public profile, no wealth, and no obvious business value. Richard did not understand the connection, and frankly, he did not care to. In his mind, people like Margaret existed outside the world that mattered, a world built on leverage, image, and strategic advantage. Richard believed that kindness only had value if it could be photographed, packaged, and used to improve a company's public image. He began pushing David toward a different kind of relationship with Margaret, one built entirely around publicity rather than gratitude. Richard suggested that David turn his growing curiosity about Margaret into a media opportunity, a heartwarming story about a billionaire reconnecting with an old teacher, complete with cameras and a carefully worded press release. David refused immediately, uncomfortable with the idea of turning something this personal into a performance for public approval. Richard pushed harder, arguing that the world needed stories like this, that it would humanize David's brand and soften his reputation as a cold, calculating businessman. David told him, firmly and without room for negotiation, that whatever this was between him and Margaret, it was not for sale and it was not for headlines. Frustrated but unwilling to let the idea go entirely, Richard took matters into his own hands. He visited Margaret directly, without David's knowledge, hoping to convince her to agree to a public reunion event that would benefit the company's image. When Margaret firmly declined, explaining that she wanted no attention and no spotlight, Richard grew impatient and made a comment that would later reach David's ears. He told her that people like her, poor and forgotten, should be grateful that someone as powerful as David was even paying attention to them at all. Margaret did not argue with him. She simply looked at him with quiet disappointment and asked him to leave. When David eventually learned what Richard had said to Margaret, something in him hardened in a way that surprised even himself. He confronted Richard directly, telling him that respect could not be measured in dollars and that some debts in life were never meant to be repaid with money, only honored with gratitude. Richard tried to defend himself, insisting he was only thinking about the company's interests. David told him plainly that if he ever spoke to Margaret that way again, their working relationship would end immediately. It was the first time in years that David had drawn a line this firm over something that had nothing to do with profit. Around this same time, David began noticing small, unexplained details whenever he visited Margaret's modest apartment. She kept an old, worn notebook on her shelf, its cover cracked and held together with tape, and she never let anyone look inside it. She always sat 2 chairs at her small kitchen table, even though she lived alone, and one of those chairs was never used. When David gently asked about it, she told him quietly that the chair once belonged to her husband, a man who had passed away many years earlier, a man who had always believed deeply in helping children who had no one else looking out for them. She said keeping the chair there made her feel like he was still part of the choices she made. One evening, while helping Margaret organize some old boxes in her closet, David came across a small photograph tucked between the pages of a folder. It showed a young teenage boy standing beside a younger version of Margaret outside a school building, though the boy's face was partially turned away from the camera, caught mid-laugh at something just out of frame. Something about the image made David's hands go still. He asked her who the boy was, and for the first time since they had reconnected, Margaret hesitated, her eyes glistening slightly before she quietly excused herself to make tea, leaving the question hanging unanswered in the air between them. That same night, unable to shake the feeling building inside him, David asked if he could look through the old notebook she kept on her shelf. Margaret was quiet for a long moment, then finally nodded, telling him she supposed it was time. Inside, David found old-school essays written in handwriting he slowly began to recognize as his own, records from a scholarship program he remembered applying for as a teenager, and letters, dozens of them, Written by Margaret over the years, addressed to no one in particular, simply documenting her hopes for a boy she had once quietly helped without ever expecting anything in return. Near the back of the notebook, David found a single folded letter, its paper soft and worn from being handled many times over the years. His hands trembled slightly as he unfolded it. It read, "Dear Daniel, you may never know my name, and that was always my choice. But I hope one day, if life ever brings us back together, you will understand that someone believed in you when the rest of the world had already given up. You were never a burden. You were simply a light that needed a little help staying lit." It was signed, simply, Mrs. Margaret Ellison. David sat in silence for a long time after reading it, the notebook resting in his lap, decades of unanswered questions finally settling into place. The woman who had quietly saved his life, who had given him food, dignity, and a chance at a future, had been sitting across from him for weeks, gently guiding him toward this exact moment without ever demanding recognition for herself. He looked up at her, his voice breaking as he asked her why she had never told him the truth all those years ago. Margaret took his hand gently and told him she never wanted him to feel like his success belonged to her. She wanted him to believe, fully and completely, that he had earned every bit of it himself. In the days that followed, David returned to his office with a clarity he had not felt in years. Richard, still focused on turning this story into a public relations opportunity, pushed once more, reminding David that investors were waiting and that a heartfelt public announcement could still work in the company's favor. David looked at him calmly and said something that Richard would remember for a long time afterward. He told him that Richard had spent years teaching him how to build companies and close deals, but Margaret had spent a lifetime teaching him how to remain human while doing it. He said that some things were not meant to be turned into strategy, and this was one of them. David chose to honor Margaret not with a press conference, not with a public spectacle, but with something far more personal. He quietly funded the renovation of the old classroom where she had once taught, restoring it with new books, new supplies, and updated furniture for the students who now filled those seats every day. He made sure her name was placed above the door, not as a marketing decision, but as a simple, lasting tribute to a woman who had spent her life giving without ever asking for credit. The building was renamed the Margaret Ellison Learning Center, a place where struggling students could receive quiet, steady support, the same kind of support that had once changed the course of David's entire life. On the day of the small private dedication ceremony, Margaret stood quietly at the back of the room, uncomfortable with the attention even now. David walked over, took her hand, and told her that he did not need the entire world to know her story. He only needed her to know that he remembered, that he understood, and that he would spend the rest of his life making sure her kindness continued reaching other children who needed it just as badly as he once did. Margaret smiled, tears gathering in her eyes, and told him that was more than enough, that it always had been. Some people spend their lives building fortunes, leaving behind buildings with their names on them, headlines that fade within a year, and bank accounts that mean very little once they are gone. Others leave behind something far quieter, but infinitely more lasting, a life they reached out and gently changed when no one else was paying attention. Margaret Ellison never asked to be remembered. She simply asked the world to look a little closer at the people it tends to overlook, the tired, the quiet, the ones counting coins alone in a corner booth, because sometimes the person who changes everything is sitting closer than you think. If you discovered one day that someone had quietly changed the entire direction of your life years ago without ever asking for anything in return, what would you do? Would you want to sit down and finally thank them face to face? Or would some part of you simply want to carry that quiet gratitude in your heart, the same way it was given to you, without needing anything more than the memory itself? Tell us your honest answer in the comments below, and if this story moved you even a little, share it with someone who might need to hear it today.